remind you of our next two programs. On the 17th of March at 12 noon, there will be a luncheon here, and our guest will be Alan Guthrie, who's the Canadian ambassador to the United States. On the 31st of March, in the evening, at the same time that we're meeting tonight, 5:40, Hugo Margain, the ambassador of Mexico to the United States, will speak. I'm substituting for Mr. Broom, the chairman of our board of trustees, who's out of the country. We're fortunate to have with us this evening a seasoned and distinguished professional foreign service officer, who now holds the position of Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. John Holdridge, the rank of ambassador, is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, entered the Foreign Service in 1948. He attended Chinese language school at both Harvard and Cornell. He was assigned to tours of duty in Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Singapore early in his career. He became an international relations officer, an officer in charge of political affairs for China at the Department of State subsequently. He was head of the political section of our embassy in Hong Kong in 1962 to 1966. He served as deputy director and then director for research and analysis for East Asia and Pacific. He returned to Washington, was subsequently assigned to National Security Council. I really should hasten that he was given a Superior Honor Award while serving as Director of Research and Analysis. And so it really was subsequently that he got something. We're the senior staff member for the Far East, that is the National Security Council. Assignment. He served, starting in 1973, as Deputy Chief of Mission for our liaison office when it was opened in King. 2 years later, he was appointed ambassador to Singapore. In 1978, became National Intelligence Officer for Southeast for East Asia on the National Intelligence Council. In 1981, he was appointed to his present position as Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. Ambassador Holdridge has agreed to follow our usual format. We'll speak for about 15 minutes, emphasizing our recent evolution of our relations with the nations of Southeast Asia, at which time after which he'll field questions on any aspect of the responsibilities at the present time. During the question and answer period, I'll recognize the questioners and we, of course, will answer the questions. We're deep fortunate to have such an experienced professional with us. We appreciate both Mrs. Holdridge and his making the trip to Baltimore. It's a great deal of pleasure to introduce the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Mr. John Holdridge.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bird. It's a real pleasure to be here under such really striking circumstances. I've been to Baltimore before, but before this particular building was constructed, and I must say my wife and I are just over the project. It's an amazing development. Now, this evening, as Dr. Bird said, I will talk about Southeast Asia particularly. This is for no particular reason other than once before you apparently had ties of men. Chinese ambassador here, so we've probably got some slants on their approach, at any rate, to China policy. And you've also heard from a number of distinguished gentlemen on Japan. So that doesn't leave me much more to cover. I can cover Korea, of course, but I don't want to just focus on one particular area. I'd like to get onto a broader one, which gets me into Southeast Asia. And in doing so, though, let me make a few preliminary remarks about policy in general. What is it that we are trying to do? I've heard it said, without any justification, frankly, that we don't have any philosophy, that the Reagan administration is just running around and doing various things, but there's no particular guideline or central approach, and I want to disabuse you of that fact. A number of things that we're trying to do. First and foremost, I have to say, is to restore a degree of credibility and respect for us in the minds of our friends in my area, of course, throughout Asia as a whole, East Asia. That for various reasons, which I won't go into here, we did have a decline in credibility in the minds of our Asian friends. And we've now tried to put ourselves back into a position where they can rely upon us as an ally to call on in time of need, and an ally which will be there to provide the kinds of resources which they believe they require in the present circumstances. And by this I mean economic resources, and I also mean military, because we do have a very important military component in the area in which I operate. Which brings me up to the next point that I would like to talk about, and that is, we do have a problem, a military problem, a security one, of rather massive proportions. And that flows essentially from the role of the Soviet Union. I make no apologies for this. It's a fact that we have to admit it and we have to face up to it. Interestingly enough, the Soviet Union, the single greatest concentration of Soviet sea power you're going to find anywhere, happens not to be against NATO operating out of Murmansk, but it happens to be the Soviet Pacific Fleet. That fleet is growing steadily, incrementally, and we see it in the fact that the Soviets have one of their two more modern aircraft carriers, with Minsk operating out of Vladivostok. There are cruisers, there are various kinds of other ships, destroyers. In fact, Admiral Bob Long, who's our Commander-in-Chief Pacific in Honolulu, tells me that the Soviets have more destroyers in their Pacific fleet than we have ships as a whole in our entire 7th Fleet, which gives you, again, an idea of the problem that we face. The Soviets have 51 ground divisions operating against China in Mongolia. They have other divisions in the Soviet Far East, north of Japan. We see backfires, we see SS-20s, we see the most modern Soviet aircraft positioned all along the East Asian area. And we see, projecting from Petropavlovsk and Vladivostok, a very significant amount of Soviet military power. Down the coast of Asia into Cam Bay in Vietnam, which is causing us a considerable amount of concern. And from there, through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean, all the way over to Dahlak Island, the Red Sea. And this is the problem that we have to contend with. No one can deny the fact that we have a security problem to deal with, and it's one of major proportions. Now, the next thing that we're trying to do, and this is a general policy throughout the world, is to play catch-up ball. You've heard the President, or read what the President has said about the necessity of maintaining the defense budget. I want this to give you an explanation of, from my standpoint, why this is necessary. But in the time that it's going to take us to catch up, we're going to have a little problem. And that is, it takes a while to build a 97,000-ton aircraft carrier, something of that sort. It's going to be quite a while before we can really catch up to the Soviets. So another feature of our policy is that we're trying to get friends and allies, those who can and should properly, to do more and helping to fill up where we are stretched thin. I'm referring more specifically to Japan, but others can help out as well. I'm impressed by the fact, for example, that the Australians have just bought the flagship of the Royal Navy, HMS Illustrious, a carrier, and they're going to be building up quite a naval force of their own into the Indian Ocean or operating around Australia and the Southwest Pacific or in the Straits of Malacca. All this is very helpful at a time when we ourselves are feeling pinched. So that's another policy, to get people to do more. Another aspect of our policy is, in cases where countries feel that they're menaced by a security situation, as in the case of Thailand, which has Vietnamese troops on its border, we try to provide military assistance through our Foreign Military Assistance Program, a variety of kinds of military assistance, which I'll get to in a moment. We have FMS sales, we have other types of military aid in virtually every country in East Asia. This is important. If they want to do something on their own to stem this tide, to respond to a security threat, then we believe it's important to help them get the wherewithal to do so. Now, we are not forgetting that there is an economic problem, that there is what one would call loosely the North-South situation to contend with. The imbalance in economic development between the northern countries and the countries of the more southern hemisphere. This is something which we have to contend with all the time. And we do have aid programs, economic assistance programs, which are to be responsive to the desires of peoples in various countries to get the kind of economic development which they believe is necessary. Without this kind of economic growth, you're going to have political tensions and social tensions regardless of the existence of the Soviet threat. And we indeed are aware of this problem, and in fact are coming up, I hope, in this next fiscal year with something like $350 billion of economic assistance for East Asia. We are not the most important area, it seems, in terms of the threat, but nevertheless we are getting a substantial proportion. Finally, let me say there is one very important feature of what we're trying to do, and that is to come to grips with the problems of the American economy. When I talk about military assistance abroad, or when I talk about economic aid, this has to depend on a strong, vigorous, growing American economy. And that is what the President and the administration are trying to do, is to put us back into a situation of economic growth so that we can, in fact, sustain the kinds of requirements that we have abroad in addition to meeting the needs of our own people. So this, I think, will cover the general programs and policies that we have throughout the world and do apply equally well to East Asia. Now let me turn to the Southeast. We have two significant features on our horizon. One is the existence of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a grouping of 5 countries, the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, which have, over the last several years, become remarkably coherent, and they've come together in a very effective way, economically first, and now politically. And we, in fact, are tending more and more to deal with these 5 countries as a group, rather than individually. On Friday of this week, I intend to have a meeting with a group of 5 ambassadors from the countries concerned in what they call the AWC, the ASEAN Washington Committee. And more I find that we discuss policy issues of interest to the United States and the ASEAN countries. We do it in this kind of a format. Sometimes across a table in a conference room. I'm trying to do it a little more informally this next time. And in the medium of a luncheon. And in this way, we can discuss what they want and what we be able to help or do, and what we want also, in a very congenial atmosphere. So we are working very closely with ASEAN, and I will get back to that too in a minute. The other great problem that we face, or not problem necessarily when I talk about ASEAN, the other thing that looms large on the horizon, though, is the existence of the Kampuchean War and the Vietnam problem that we still have. We've inherited this one from previous administrations. Indeed, it goes all the way back to the 50s. I can recall at my first post in Bangkok, and this was in 1950-odd, when at that time we were just discussing what to do about the French role in Indochina, and we wanted the French to join us in the NATO alliance, which eventually emerged, and so we were very responsive to what the French wanted us to do in Indochina, which has caused us a little problem over many years. However, we do have a Vietnam problem of considerable proportions to grapple with, and this is a juxtaposition to the ASEAN situation. Now let me talk a little bit about ASEAN. I don't want to overspend my time here. It's very important to us in a number of different ways. Economically, it happens to be our 5th largest trading partner. Our total volume of trade in 1981 was around $20 billion both ways. When I tell you that our total volume of trade with Japan was $60 billion, you begin to see the proportions of our trade and the importance thereof with ASEAN. Our total volume of trade, incidentally, with East Asia runs around $154 billion. And this exceeds the total volume of trade with Europe. So more and more in the economic sense, our attention is swinging to the Asian-Pacific region. ASEAN is important in this regard. We have big American investments, quite a few countries. I expect they will continue to grow. And this coming week, to show you how important the relationship is. We are having what we call the U.S.-ASEAN Economic Dialogue. A number of ASEAN ambassadors or directors general of their foreign services are coming to Washington to discuss economic problems of mutual interest. And we're going to be hit with such things as the price of tin and the price of natural rubber and how we can be helpful in a whole array of things. We're right now under the gun from the Malaysians because of the tin situation. But if anybody asks me a question, I'll try to get through that one. But I don't want to discuss it at length now. I think it might bore you, and sometimes does me. It's quite a problem, however. It's very important to the Malaysians. So we do deal with Malaysia as an entity, but with ASEAN as a whole, very much intimate in the economic sense. Now, strategically, ASEAN is extremely important as well. Looking at the map, you will see that Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia lie right astride the Straits of Malacca, through which 75% or thereabouts of Japan's imported energy from the Middle East must travel. I will say here that Japan remains and will be for a long time to come, I'm sure, a keystone of our East Asian policy. And if Japan were unable to get the kinds of energy it needs, we might have a very, very tense situation indeed to cope with. So strategically, ASEAN is important to us, and of course to other countries in the world as well, such as Japan and China. So we can see another advantage of why we work with ASEAN as an entity. Now, the crux of the matter over the last few years has been the confrontation that ASEAN has maintained with Vietnam. In 1978, for reasons which I believe related not to the problem in Kampuchea generated by Pol Pot and the fact that there had been border incidents between Vietnam and Kampuchea, the Vietnamese chose to invade Kampuchea with something like 200,000 troops and swept right across over to the Thai border. And this has been a running sore in Southeast Asia ever since. The ASEAN countries as a group, which were beginning to cooperate rather loosely in the economic sense prior to 1978, congealed immediately into what I've already described as a very effective political unity. And since 1978, they have been calling regularly in the United Nations General Assembly for the withdrawal of all Vietnamese forces from Kampuchea. There was a conference last year in July, an international conference on Kampuchea, which further addressed the problem. The vote in the United Nations has been rather marked. This last vote was, I think, 101 countries supporting the ASEAN resolution, getting the Vietnamese out of Kampuchea. We support ASEAN in this endeavor. We have our own problems with Vietnam, but I'm not going to put those on as the leading configuration of what we're trying to do. We see it to our advantage, the advantage of the ASEAN countries, to be supportive of them and what they are trying to do vis-a-vis Vietnam and Kampuchean situation. As I've mentioned, Thailand is what we call a frontline state, and is getting, I hope, if the Congress of the United States sees favorably, in 1983, perhaps as much as $90 million in military assistance, because it obviously has a problem. So we see it to our advantage anyway, to help out ASEAN in juxtaposition to Vietnam. When I say help out, I mean precisely that. We take a supportive role. We are not going to be out in front. We are not going to be telling these countries what to do. We will simply be helpful where we can be helpful, economically and politically, and militarily, if they ask us for that type of assistance. I think that the policy that ASEAN has of trying to keep Vietnam isolated and trying to bring international pressure to bear against Vietnam is beginning to bear fruit. The Vietnamese are extremely conscious of their political isolation. They're also extremely conscious of the economic burden that they bear. Now, some would argue that by putting Vietnam in this kind of purdah, for example, you simply force them into the arms of the Soviet Union. They were there already. They made that choice in 1978. All the time that they were building up for the invasion of Kampuchea, my predecessor was discussing with the Vietnamese the normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam. And I think the Vietnamese were intelligent enough to understand that if there were normalized relations, there would have been U.S. economic assistance. At one point, or not, maybe not immediately, but in due course. And the Vietnamese, nevertheless, chose to go into Kampuchea. They cut their ties, you might say, with the Western world and identified themselves with the Soviet Union. Indeed, in July 1978, they had joined CEMA, the Eastern European Economic Bloc, and then on the 4th of November 1978, they signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. So they went. Once they had the Soviets seemingly on their side, they made that choice. And when ASEAN seeks to keep Vietnam isolated and to bring economic pressures to bear against Vietnam, we will be supportive of that. We are not, however, seeking to bleed Vietnam white. That is not our policy, nor is it ASEAN's. What we want is a negotiated political settlement reached as soon as possible, which would involve the withdrawal of all Vietnamese troops from Kampuchea and permit the exercise of self-determination by the Kampuchean people themselves. I don't think that's too much to demand. And indeed, as I said, progressively over the years, over the last 3 years, more and more and more countries of the world have seen the logic and have seen the similarities between Kampuchea and Afghanistan. So maybe I better stop right about now and say I've given you some highlights of what we're trying to do, the ASEAN role, and I would be happy to discuss the relationship with any ASEAN country individually, and also happy to go into any other details that you'd like about our relationship, or lack thereof, with Vietnam. And at this point, let's go to the floor open questions. I'll let Dr. Bird be the artist.
There's been some complaint that the ASEAN legal studies have been the coalition for this support. I don't know if you can speak to what evidence is supporting.
Well, the problem being about the coalition is it's awfully hard to see it taking shape. There are 3 elements involved in this Kampuchean situation. There is the so-called DK. This is the Democratic Khmer, which is the Pol Pot forces, the very people who carried on the campaign of atrocities against the Kampuchean people after the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975. There is a new force that is building up now called the KPNLF, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front, with Son Sann, a very respected Kampuchean leader, as the main force in it. And the third element is Prince Sihanouk, who is now residing in his old stamping ground in Peking. How to get these 3 groups together? I might add here, we support ASEAN in keeping the DK in the United Nations, but only because to keep the DK in keeps the Vietnamese-supported puppet government, if you will, Heng Sen-Rin, out. Not that we love the DK, we despise it for what it's done. And we are trying to see if we can be helpful in injecting a democratic component, the KPNLF essentially, into the anti-Vietnamese forces. We support the coalition, but we can't do this ourselves. It's up to the people concerned to work out their own modus vivendi. Now, at the moment in Beijing, Kim Sun-Pan, who is the representative of the DK, has in fact been talking to Sihanouk. There seems to be some slight meeting of the minds there. Son Sann is either in China now or on his way there. He may not talk to the other 2 groups together, but I think he will be talking to them seriatim, either in Peking or maybe in Canton, and perhaps out of this we will see the formation of some kind of a united front or a coalition or whatever against the Vietnamese in Kampuchea. We support this. The only problem, as I said, is what do you support when there isn't anything there? It's something that they've got to work out themselves, and we've told them this. And we've also said to the ASEAN, whatever comes out has to be acceptable to ASEAN, and then we will play a supportive role. Our policy is that we will provide humanitarian assistance to those forces that are aligned against Vietnam. We will provide what kind of political and moral support we can. We are not going to involve ourselves in any military aid, but we do believe it's important that all these elements opposed to the Vietnamese occupation of Kampuchea get together.
Mr. Holdridge, continuing to the last week, could you give us a review of the last decade U.S. relations, as you see them, and answer this very specific charge that some people believe that this administration, with its over-conservative tendencies, leaning towards Taiwan, may have set us back in our relations back further than we were in 1973.
I could just spend the rest of the evening on that one. Thank you, Pete. Thank you. Okay, the last 10 years have seen a rather remarkable coming together of Chinese and American interests. We accepted from the very beginning of the Shanghai Communique that the raison d'etre of this relationship had to be the Soviet Union. And you will recall in the Shanghai Communique, we talked about hegemonism and our resistance to it. But in addition to that, there are a lot of other obvious advantages which the Chinese perceived and which we perceived. From our standpoint, we're very interested in seeing China come out of its shell, to come out into the modern world and to have contacts with people who are not ideologues and who have a wider frame of reference in their thinking. And this, we think, will be helpful in getting the Chinese to modernize and bring them along in their own approach to their problems. And the fact that they've chosen to send 7,000 students to the United States, more than they've sent to any other country, is a token from our standpoint of how well this is working. Now, there are also other advantages from the Chinese standpoint, some of which they don't believe have been quite realized. Technology transfer, getting China to the forefront of modern nations through inputs from the United States, such as perhaps satellite technology or aircraft or whatever. And, of course, there remains this constant advantage to the both of us that without any kind of a formal alliance, we have managed to keep ourselves pointed generally in the same direction vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and many of the problems of the world. I should say here that we see a great deal in common with China with respect to the Kampuchean Vietnam situation and ASEAN. Now, there are some variations here which are important ones in that the Chinese support the DK, it seems, almost unqualifiedly, and we do not. And we have problems with our ASEAN countries sometimes. It seems to them that we take the Chinese line in preference to the ASEAN countries. I would say here parenthetically, when I see my friends on Friday, I'm going to tell them if it ever comes down to a crunch, if there is a choice to be made between the ASEAN approach to the Kampuchean situation and the Chinese, we will, of course, take the ASEAN approach. However, I don't know if I need to go into too much chapter and verse, Pete, but I think there have been enormous advantages to both of us over the years, scientifically, technologically, in exchange of persons, strategically speaking, in the fact that we've kept together. The Seventh Fleet was created after World War II essentially to be on guard against Communist China. It is not now so tasked. And the fact that it is not so tasked allows it to spend a significant part of the time in response to problems which are generated in other parts of the world. The Seventh Fleet responsibility goes all the way over to the east coast of Africa. And our carriers are spending a lot of time in the Indian Ocean and all the way up into the Persian Gulf. So the fact that we don't have to worry about China strategically is an important feature. The Chinese are holding down approximately 20 to 25% of the total Soviet outlay for military hardware and manpower. I think that's important. Now, let's have the last part of your question again, Pete.
Well, whether or not this present administration, because of some of its ultra-conservative views, has to push back our relations over Taiwan now, specifically, what they were 10 years ago.
I think that's probably
Maybe
correct.
okay,
But there are a number of features that have come along. Now,
When we hear that question of whether the current administration's policy has set down our relationship.
obviously what they were 10 years ago. No. That there is one difference between this administration and the preceding one, and that is we do acknowledge that there is a Taiwan. We have an unofficial relationship with the people of Taiwan, and the President of the United States feels very strongly that these people are old friends and they should not be treated in a shabby way. Let me say here, just as an example of how shabby treatment comes along, Taiwan was given no warning whatsoever in 1978 for normalization between the U.S. and China. occurred. My friend Ambassador Len Unger had to chase around town in Taipei way far into the night to catch Zhang Jinghua to give him the message. Jinghua, the president of the Republic of China at that time, as we saw in Taiwan. He finally got to him about 2:30 in the morning. Now, how's that for a way to treat an old friend? You know, no warning whatsoever, nothing. Just here it is, cold turkey. And that was shabby treatment. The president believes that we should not treat old friends in such a way. Now, this does not mean we are going to change the relationship back to what it was. We are not going to reverse the course of normalization. The relationship with Taiwan will continue to be a non-official relationship. And as in the case of the preceding administration, this involves an arms sales component, which will also continue. In fact, there is legislation in the United States which dictates this kind of an arms sales relationship. And we cannot avoid it, even if we wanted to, which we don't. Now, at the same time, however, we've told the Chinese we want to expand and broaden the strategically based relationship with them. Now you can say, how are you going to do this? Is this going to be done with mirrors? The Chinese, unfortunately from our standpoint, are now going through a rather traumatic, I believe, kind of a convulsion internally, in which at last there is a showdown between the former supporters of Mao Zedong, the man who ran China from 1957 until his death in 1976, practically without anybody else's inputs and as an intense ideologue, a man who believed in a continuing revolution, and the revolution should be carried through to the end, and politics taking command and so on, and ran China into a miserable state, as my wife and I can tell you from our own experiences there from 1973 to 1975. The present leadership under Deng Xiaoping is trying awfully hard to break away from these shackles of the past, as exemplified by the fact now, you've probably seen this in the press, that the Chinese are trying to purge, I guess that's a loose word, let me say, they're trying to reform the party by getting rid of people who are technologically inferior, managerially incompetent, or politically opposed to what Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues are trying to do. And those who are in the firing line, those who are going to be removed, are fighting back with every weapon at their disposal. Now, this brings in this whole question of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which have continued over many years, went on throughout the whole period of the Carter administration post-normalization, from 1979 until the end of the Carter administration, and are continuing now. The Chinese accepted the arms sales situation then because of the Vietnam era. The Vietnam inputs. The Chinese were, I think, aware in 1978 that they were going to have to go into Vietnam. They wanted the United States on their team the same way that the Vietnamese had dragged in the Soviet Union. I mentioned that Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation. So the Chinese, in a hurry, knowing they were going into Vietnam, normalized relationship with us. The whole thing was squared away in 2 weeks, from the 1st of December until the 15th of December, after many years of haggling. They accepted it then, but now the continued arms sales to Taiwan becomes an element in Chinese domestic politics. It was quite clear at the time, and subsequently, there were many in China who criticized Deng Xiaoping for letting the arms sales relationship continue. Didn't China give away too much to the United States? What was it getting in return? And this is quite clearly one of the elements of what's going on now, and why it is, quite apart from whatever it is that the president who may have said or what he was doing, this was an element that was bound to come to a head. It has come to a head now, and this is the problem that we're facing. That there are those in China who are using the arms sales relationship, the whole U.S.-Taiwan relationship, as a weapon against Deng Xiaoping. And I think that we have evidence to this, there's no doubt about it. And that this is why we have the tenseness at this particular moment. Now, we are engaged in discussions with the Chinese on this whole question. These discussions are aimed at finding a modus vivendi between the continued U.S. arms sales to Taiwan of a volume sufficient to meet Taiwan's military needs, and at the same time to maintain and expand the relationship with Beijing. I hope we can find a formula. I'm not saying that this is possible, and I could not predict the outcome. It's going to be a very difficult situation indeed. But we do not want a reversion, nor, in my judgment, do the Chinese.
Ambassador, recently some Vietnam veterans returned to Vietnam. Did you comment on the State Department?
Yes, we briefed them because we couldn't say nay. That if Americans wish to travel to Vietnam to look into the POW MIA situation, this is within their rights, and in fact, we do offer such encouragement, but we warn them, bear in mind that you're likely to be made use of by Vietnamese propaganda, which they were. And they did not bring back anything concrete, and I think the attitude toward the Vietnam veterans was exemplified by Ann Griffiths, who's the permanent secretary of the National League of Families of prisoners of war missing in action in Southeast Asia. And she was extremely critical of that group. Now, we acknowledge that there is a problem, but the Vietnamese, as a result of the Paris Agreement, are obliged to account for all the MIAs, and they have not done so. I think we have ample reason to believe that they're using this issue in the hopes of exacting some kind of a political payment for us if they resolve it quickly. We have just sent an official mission to Hanoi, led by Rich Armitage from the Pentagon, staffed out by people from my bureau as well as from other people from the Pentagon. And they did engage in talks, and this is the way we would prefer to do it, rather than to have private citizens going in there and getting some kind of vague assurances as a payment for, say, some kind of propaganda advantage gained by the Vietnamese. We would prefer to have the direct talks, impress upon the Vietnamese the depth of sentiment in the United States about this issue, the humanitarian concerns which they should be worried about, and their obligation to be forthcoming in accounting for the MIAs. There was some slight progress made by our latest group, but not very much, I must tell you. And it remains, I think, pretty much clear that what the Vietnamese are still trying to do is to get political benefit from the POW MIA issue.
What do you hear you saying about Laos? They get lost in the shuffle and all that?
Laos is part of the Confederation of Indo-Chinese States, which I believe the Vietnamese set out to establish by their attack on Kampuchea in 1978. In fact, they had already been in Laos and are still there. There must be 4 Vietnamese divisions in Laos, and there are very few things said by the administration in Vientiane which do not seem to paraphrase what the Vietnamese would say. However, I will say this, that there is apparently a little slippage, that the Laotians are not 100% in accord with the Vietnamese. They keep telling us that they want to maintain their own relationship with us. They've told other ASEAN countries that too. Now, this could be just a ploy, I don't know. Trying to suggest that there's a little fluidity here, where fluidity doesn't exist. I frankly don't know. But we are willing to give the Vietnamese the benefit of allow a certain amount of doubt. That we have an embassy in Vientiane that's staffed by a charge d'affaires, total number of 6 officers. It's quite small, but we still try to maintain a contact with the Lao government in the hopes that maybe at some point in time we'll get something back from this. The Lao also have an obligation to account for POW MIAs. That there are approximately 350 Americans still on the list of the missing who went down to Laos. And we've got very few words back, and we keep trying to attack the problem with the Lao government, with not much success, but we're going to keep trying. There is a difference there, we hope, and we're going to maintain this contact.
I have a follow-up question about Taiwan, China, Taiwan issue. Has the United States recognized the sovereignty of Taiwan or not? I understand that you don't take on the official right to acknowledge
in the joint communique, we acknowledged, and in the Shanghai communique, we did not challenge the contention on both sides of the Taiwan Strait that Taiwan is a part of China, that there's only one China and Taiwan is a part of it. Interestingly enough, the word acknowledge, if you look it up in your Webster's dictionary, you will find the first synonym for it is recognize, and in Chinese, the word is the same, chengren. So I don't know where we stand on this, but we are prepared to stand by the phraseology, and I say this The Shanghai and joint communiques, and I have no further comment.
I find a little disturbing the initial remarks framing our general policy. It sounds like Cold Warrior. It sounds like Russia the boogeyman. It sounds like American diplomacy is based on a reactive diplomacy of what they're doing. Well, specifically with regard to Asia, what do you perceive as the threat posed by Russia? What are their interests in this region?
All right. Now that you've given me the opportunity, I mentioned 51 divisions stationed along the Sino-Soviet border, including 5 in Mongolia, backfire bombers, SS-20 missiles, the most modern SSBMs operating out of Petropavlovsk and targeting on the United States, by the way, as well as other areas. The constant improvement, not only in quantity, but in quality. When I first began to look at this in the intelligence standpoint, say about 1979, there were 40 Soviet divisions. There are now 51. And they're growing all the time. Now, I can't answer why the Soviets are doing this, but they are doing it. Now, what is their objective in East Asia, or anywhere else in the world? I should say that simply to build up a sufficient degree of military power that they can intimidate others into doing what the Soviets would want them to do, conceivably without the necessity of actually using this force, but at least having a force in being which is sufficiently large and possibly larger than what we are able to muster to challenge the role of the United States, the reliability of the United States, and to challenge the strategic balance which has been in existence for quite some time in East Asia. Let me say here that one of the intrinsic features of our whole relationship with ASEAN, if you ask any of the leaders of any of those countries if the United States should leave, they will say with horror, oh no. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, they all want us there. They regard us as a stabilizing force, maintaining the balance of power there against what they see as a constant encroachment of Soviet power, now in Cam Bay. The Soviets, by the way, in Cam Bay have what we would call an advanced operating base. It certainly is not the equivalent of what we have in Subic. But there are usually 8 or 9 or 10 Soviet warships there at any time. They are operating Bear Ds out of Cam Bay, flying anti-submarine and other missions from Cameron out over the South China Sea. And they are using Cameron as a stepping stone all the way to Dalak Island. It's a very important adjunct in terms of communications, command and control, and logistical support for what they're doing in the Indian Ocean. Now, if the Soviets would indeed go through an effort to, from our standpoint, to be responsive to our concerns, what do we say? Responsibility and reciprocity in world affairs. We don't ask a great deal. But when you say it disturbs you that we've got a boogeyman there, it disturbs me too. But I'm willing to face it as a reality. You seem to say that it doesn't exist. I say it does exist, and it has to be dealt with. And then this is an unfortunate feature of international relations at this time.
There's little mention in the press these days of the refugee policy in Southeast Asia. Would you address that?
It still exists. It's not in the proportions as before. And from the Vietnamese standpoint, apparently they're taking some steps on the public security apparatus to prevent the outflow of refugees. It's not as easy as it used to be. I think they've lost a very substantial proportion of their talented, educated people, the managerial class, the ones who know how to be engineers or how to run various kinds of enterprises. A lot of those have left. But the flow has diminished, but it still is in the proportion of something around 8,000 or 9,000 a month in terms of boat people making their way into various countries of Southeast Asia. Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore doesn't take anybody. They sometimes make their way down into Indonesia, which is at this moment has about 15,000 in holding camps in a couple of islands off the coast. No, the problem exists with us. And it may get worse. We're anticipating a food shortage this coming dry season, or rainy season rather, in Kampuchea, which could mean a great, larger, much more of an outflow of people from Kampuchea. There's still over 250,000 Campuchean refugees in various camps along the border, to give you an estimate of that, the size of that problem, and about 35 to 40,000 Lao in camps in Thailand. Now, in order to keep the receptivity going on the part of the country's concerned, the principle of first asylum, it's very important that we and other countries live up to our responsibility to offer refuges to these people, to take them. And here's where one of the problems comes up. You know, when we've got an unemployment situation in the United States, sometimes in some areas of the U.S., there's objection to having more Vietnamese come in. They seem to be competing fairly successfully for certain types of jobs. Nevertheless, we have talked to the Congress a few months ago. The Congress has agreed that we may bring in, say, 100,000 people this year. The funds voted dropped down to 72,000 people. However, the Congress has said that if there is an emergency situation, we can go back and ask for more funds. And in fact, if the emergency gets too big, we can go beyond 100,000 spaces. We are concerned about this problem, and I think it's the responsibility of everybody in the United States to do our share to help to take this refugee burden, to give these people onward mobility, a place to live, and a place to settle down, and a place to earn a living. And I think we will continue to do our share.
Would you comment on the stability of the government of the Philippines in the light of the fact that it's so important for our own naval bases, military bases in the Pacific?
I don't think anybody could say the government of the Philippines is unstable. There's a remarkable staying power on the part of President Marcos, who's now been president